I was standing at the far end of the dining room table, the hum of voices rising and falling like frantic waves breaking against the walls. China plates rattled, someone's silverware clattered to the hardwood floor, and the overhead light flickered as if it, too, had been shaken by what I had just revealed. My mother kept pressing her fingertips to her temples, muttering half-sentences she couldn't finish. My father paced a short path behind his chair, pausing every few steps to stare at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered into his house. And Vanessa, my older sister, stood frozen beside the sideboard, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles rippled at the edge of her face. "Evelyn, what did you do?" My mother's voice cracked on the last word. She looked from me to Vanessa, as if hoping her favorite daughter could explain me well enough to undo whatever had happened. Vanessa was too pale to answer. She only shook her head once, slow and disbelieving, like I had pulled a brick from the foundation of her perfectly constructed world. It was strange watching them panic. For most of my life, they assumed I was the one who couldn't adjust, the one who didn't understand how the world worked. Yet here they were, flooding the room with questions that had no answers they were ready to hear. I simply stood there, hands steady at my sides, watching their certainty unravel in real time. Their chaos didn't start at the moment I opened my folder. It started minutes earlier when Vanessa had made her announcement. I could still picture her clearly where she stood at the head of the table, back straight, shoulders set, her expression shaped into that bright, confident look she liked to call her professional face. She tapped her water glass lightly and waited for silence, because she always expected to be the center of any room. Once everyone quieted, she smiled in my direction and said she had an update about my living situation. My parents straightened immediately, eager for whatever she planned to say. I stayed still, my napkin folded in my lap, my fork resting untouched on the edge of my plate. She told us she had reviewed the rent for the duplex I lived in, the one she claimed to manage. Then she said I had not been showing her the respect she deserved, that I hardly ever complimented her anymore, that I made her feel unappreciated when she carried so much of the family's responsibilities. Her voice softened in a way she thought made her sound reasonable. She said that effective next month the rent would be $12,000 because emotional strain had financial consequences, and she would no longer discount those costs for me. A few people laughed. They thought she was making a joke. When she didn't laugh with them, the air shifted uncomfortably. My mother was the first to speak. She told me that maybe paying more would teach me not to take my sister for granted. My father nodded as if that were the obvious conclusion. I sat there, silent, watching as their smiles spread across their faces. The thing that struck me most was how certain they were that I would fold. It wasn't new. They had always believed that anything Vanessa decided would naturally become my reality, and maybe for a long time I let them think that. Pushing back only made things worse. Letting Vanessa win kept the peace, or at least that was how they framed it. They told me letting her shine was the right thing to do for the family. But that night, something settled in me too heavily to ignore. Their laughter, their expectation that I would simply nod and agree to something so outrageous, told me everything I needed to know. They still saw me as the quiet daughter who never crossed a line, who never insisted on a boundary, who didn't notice when she was being pushed out of her own life. So I stayed quiet, not in surrender, but in preparation. Vanessa kept talking about rising market values and personal obligations while I waited for the exact moment she would hand me the contract. When she finally slid the document across the table toward me, I didn't reach for it. I didn't even glance down. Instead, I looked directly at her. It was the first time all evening she hesitated. Something in my stillness unsettled her. Her fingers hovered above the page, as if she wanted to pull the contract back. When I didn't react, she swallowed hard and glanced at my parents. They offered her small, reassuring nods, as if I were a child refusing to eat vegetables, and they expected her to coax me into compliance. Vanessa tried again. She told me I needed to sign it tonight so she could process everything by the end of the weekend. She said delaying would only prove I lacked gratitude for everything she had done. But her voice had lost the ring of confidence. It thinned at the corners, just barely, but enough that I felt the first crack in her certainty. I reached slowly for my bag, the leather soft under my palm, and the room went almost silent. Even the cousins who had been whispering at the far end of the table stopped to watch. No one expected anything from me beyond quiet obedience. They couldn't imagine I had brought something of my own. My heart didn't race. My breath stayed even. There was no trembling in my hands. I had already lived through years of being underestimated. This moment had been building long before Vanessa lifted her glass to call for everyone's attention. I placed the folder on the table. My fingers rested on the edge for a moment. Not dramatic, not heavy, just enough to steady myself. Vanessa stared at it as if it were a foreign object. My father frowned. My mother whispered something under her breath, but the words never formed clearly. Even then, they still believed the evening belonged to Vanessa. They thought whatever I carried would be an apology, a compromise, some attempt to make things easier for her. They didn't understand that everything had already shifted. I lifted the cover. Paper rustled softly. Vanessa took a small, involuntary step back, and her voice caught in her throat when she tried to speak. She kept looking between me and the open folder as if she could will its contents away. That was the moment the room broke open. That was when their laughter vanished, and the panic began to bloom around the edges of their faces. They didn't know what they were looking at yet, but they knew it was something that didn't fit inside the roles they had always assigned me. My father moved closer to see. My mother's hand pressed against her chest, as if she were bracing for something impossible. Vanessa's breathing went shallow, her arms tightening across her body. I looked at each of them, one by one, and for the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking under their expectations. I felt strangely calm, steady. The kind of calm that comes not from winning, but from knowing the truth has finally stepped into the room. I closed the folder just slightly, enough to stop them from seeing more before I was ready to show it. Their faces hovered in uncertainty, waiting for me to explain something they had never imagined I could hold. And in that brief pause before anything else could be said, before the truth could be spoken aloud, I felt the weight of everything that had led us to this table. Everything Vanessa had done, everything they had allowed, everything I had survived while they weren't looking. The room was quiet now, waiting, as the last tremor of the moment settled into place. I let the silence settle for a moment longer before lifting my eyes toward the window, as if the steady darkness outside could anchor me while the room around me shifted. Their faces were still turned toward me, waiting for explanations they believed they deserved. But I felt no urgency to give them anything yet. What surprised me most was how familiar their expressions were. Shock layered over certainty, layered over the quiet assumption that whatever I had done must somehow be a misunderstanding. They had never learned to imagine a version of me who acted with intention. My mind drifted back to the years when all of this had begun long before deeds and contracts, and Vanessa's theatrics at the dinner table. It started in that house on Hawthorne Street, where every family photo tilted toward my sister, as if the frames themselves understood where the light was supposed to fall. I used to think it was normal that she arrived first in every story my parents told. Even now I can still picture her at 14, standing in the doorway, after winning another school award, while my mother clapped with a kind of pride she saved only for her. I had been sitting on the stairs holding a stack of library books, but no one turned to notice I was there. Growing up in that house meant learning how to move without making ripples. Vanessa did not ask for space. She took it. She filled rooms with her confidence and expected everyone else to adjust. My parents encouraged it. They said she was destined for big things and that I would help the family by supporting her, by not competing, by staying steady and agreeable. They said she needed praise the way some people needed reassurance. I tried to give it at first, or at least I tried not to get in her way. Praise became a kind of currency in our home, one Vanessa collected freely, and I learned not to expect. When I was 16, she came home from a statewide leadership conference with a crystal trophy that gleamed under every kitchen light. My mother gathered us all to listen to the keynote speech Vanessa had delivered. Vanessa stood in the living room reciting it word for word, her voice strong and practiced. When she finished, my parents applauded as if they had been waiting their whole lives to hear it. My father said she was the most impressive young woman he had ever seen. My mother said she would be unstoppable in whatever she chose to do. Vanessa glanced toward me, waiting for my contribution. I managed a small compliment and her smile hardened because it was not as bright as she wanted. Later that night, she accused me of being jealous and ungrateful. She said my lack of enthusiasm embarrassed her in front of our parents. That was the first time she told me I needed to pay closer attention to how I affected her. By the time we were adults, her need for admiration had grown sharper. If someone complimented me at a family gathering, she would interrupt to mention her recent sale or award. then stare at me until I said something that returned the spotlight to her. It became easier to step back, to let her take whatever space she needed to stay calm. My parents called it keeping peace in the family. They said I was the grounded one, the one who could handle being overlooked. It was meant as praise, but it felt like a warning. There was a Thanksgiving dinner not long after I graduated college, where Vanessa took her need for praise to a new level. We were seated in my parents' dining room, the entire table set with the fine china my mother only brought out twice a year. Vanessa had just won a regional real estate award, and she waited for the right moment to announce it. She lifted her wine glass and spoke about the challenges she had overcome, then paused dramatically for the applause she expected. My father stood to hug her. My mother wiped a tear. Every guest offered congratulations. I remember smiling politely, but I did not offer a grand compliment because I had been distracted by a phone call from a recruiter earlier that day. The first real lead I had received since graduation. I had been thinking about how to bring it up at dinner. When Vanessa saw my hesitation, she narrowed her eyes. The tension in the room thickened. She asked loudly why I could not celebrate her the way she always celebrated me. Before I could answer, she turned to the table and said I had always struggled with generosity, and that it was difficult having a sister who did not know how to show support. My mother patted her hand and gave me a look heavy with disappointment. My father told me there was nothing wrong with being quieter, but that I needed to learn from Vanessa about being more appreciative. I excused myself that evening and pretended I was feeling lightheaded. In truth, my chest hurt in a way I had not yet learned to name. For years, it continued like that. Vanessa rising and me stepping aside. Vanessa speaking and me absorbing her tone. My parents encouraging me to accommodate her moods because she carried so many responsibilities. They said she was under pressure, that she worked harder than anyone else, that she needed me to understand her. The strange thing is that for a long time I did. I understood her need for validation, for admiration, for control. I just did not understand mine. There was one afternoon in 2015 that still sits in my memory like a bruise. Vanessa had hosted a family barbecue in her backyard. She was showing off her newly remodeled patio and retelling a story about a difficult client she had managed to charm into closing a deal. Everyone laughed at the right moments. Everyone agreed she was brilliant. When she finished, people turned to look at me, expecting me to add something complimentary to wrap her story in a final ribbon. I smiled but said nothing because I was thinking about a project I had been building quietly for months. Vanessa watched my silence like it was a personal insult. In front of everyone, she said, I had always been ungracious, and that it was exhausting to have a sister who did not understand how to be part of a successful family. My cheeks burned. A couple of cousins looked away. My mother rushed to soothe her, telling her that I meant well but did not know how to express myself. Vanessa nodded as if that were a truth she carried with patience. That night, I sat in my car outside my apartment and let myself feel the sting of what she had said. It was not that she needed praise. It was that she believed I existed to give it. My parents never saw the problem. They said siblings had roles to play, and mine was not as glamorous as hers. They said she thrived when she felt appreciated, and that it was a small thing for me to help her maintain her confidence. Over time, I accepted that my quietness made things easier for them. It made me easier to handle. But each time Vanessa took more from me, something in me shifted, small and subtle, barely noticeable, but steady. By the time I moved into the duplex she claimed to manage, I had already learned how to anticipate her moods and adjust myself accordingly. She was successful in her career, and our parents adored her even more for it. They said she was born to lead. They said she simply carried herself like a person who understood how the world worked. I never pointed out that they had taught her that by handing her control of every room she entered. All of that weight, all of that history, gathered inside me as I stood in my parents' dining room, now watching them struggle to reconcile the woman they had always seen with the one who had quietly outgrown their expectations. They stared at me like they had never met me before, like the version of me they thought they understood had suddenly stepped out of reach. I did not say a word. I did not need to. The shift had already happened. The truth had already taken shape. They just had not heard it spoken yet. They were waiting for me to speak. But my thoughts had already slipped backward to the one person who ever taught me that silence did not have to mean surrender. I remembered the small brick house on the other side of Portland where my Aunt Miriam lived, the one place where I never felt like I took up the wrong kind of space. Every time I think about how all of this truly began, my memory goes there as if guided by something older and steadier than reason. I used to visit her on Saturday mornings when the tension in my parents' house grew too heavy to ignore. She never asked why I showed up unannounced. She would open the door in her old denim shirt, step aside, and let me in without a single question. Her living room smelled faintly of cedar and peppermint tea. Stacks of financial journals and mortgage guides sat on her coffee table the way other families kept piles of magazines. I used to sit across from her with my hands wrapped around a warm mug while she talked about the housing market like it was a language everyone should learn. One afternoon in early 2015, the air still damp from a morning rain, she looked at me long and hard after I told her about another comment Vanessa had made. I had brushed it off as usual, pretending it did not matter. Miriam leaned back in her chair, folded her glasses, and placed them on the table with a soft click. She said gently that there were patterns in this world that people choose not to see, and that I had been taught to shrink myself to fit other people's comfort. She said it was time to learn how to hold my own ground. It was the way she said it, calm and unwavering, as if she were telling me something she had always known I would eventually need. She began showing me documents from her work as a mortgage broker. At first, I only skimmed them while she brewed tea, but she noticed the way I paused over certain sections. She started explaining interest rates, titles, liens, how property ownership actually worked. Her tone was patient but never condescending. She seemed genuinely excited that I wanted to understand. She told me that real estate was not about glamour or quick money, but about understanding power, structure, and the laws that protect people who bother to learn them. Sometimes she would take me along to an open house. I would follow her through quiet hallways, listening as she explained what sellers never put in their brochures. She would point to cracks in foundations or odd placement of pipes and tell me those things often mattered more than countertops or landscaping. She said the truth of a property was always in the details, and the details were rarely where people chose to look. There was something about those afternoons that steadied me. For the first time, I felt like someone was speaking to me as if my mind mattered, as if I were capable of things no one else had imagined for me. I felt myself expand bit by bit in the warmth of her attention. When I returned home in the evenings, the contrast was almost dizzying. At my parents' house, Vanessa's voice always filled the kitchen. She would recount stories of difficult clients, dramatic negotiations, near-perfect closings. My parents would laugh, impressed with every detail. I would slip quietly to my room, still hearing Miriam's calm instructions echoing in my mind. A few months later, Miriam invited me to sit with her at her dining table. Her movements were slower then, her fingers trembling slightly when she reached for a folder. She said she wanted to show me something important. I opened the folder and found a series of investment statements, bank documents, savings accounts she had built over decades. She told me she was leaving them to me. I stared at the numbers, unsure whether I had misunderstood. She said the money was not a reward, but a responsibility. She said she had seen something in me that reminded her of herself before she learned to stop apologizing for existing. I remember the sound of my own breath as she told me she trusted me to use that money wisely. When the moment came, I remember how quietly she spoke and how heavy her words felt inside me. I wanted to argue that she should keep it for herself, that she had earned it. But she shook her head and said she had already chosen. She believed in me long before I believed in myself. She passed away later that year. The morning my mother called to tell me, her voice was tight, almost annoyed, as if Miriam had left at an inconvenient time. I drove to the house alone. The rooms were so still it felt as if they were holding their breath. I walked through the space where I had once learned how to untangle mortgage files, how to read contracts, how to trust my own thinking. Every corner felt familiar and yet impossibly distant. Clearing her things took weeks. My parents came once, only to discuss what might be donated. They did not ask about her accounts or her instructions. They did not know she had placed everything in my name. I kept that part private. It felt too sacred to share with people who had never really seen her. After the funeral, the silence in my apartment felt different. It was not the lonely kind. It was the kind that comes right before a shift. I sat on my couch with her folder open across my lap, reading through her plans again and again. $320,000. Enough to change the direction of a life. Enough to build something real, enough to free someone who had been trapped for too long. I did not touch the money for months. I let it sit where she left it, waiting like a seed beneath the soil. My parents continued treating me the same. Vanessa continued calling to tell me how overwhelmed she was by her success and how little appreciation she received from the people closest to her. She expected me to help her relieve those burdens by listening and praising her accomplishments. I did not argue. It had become a reflex to stay quiet. But the truth is that once you learn you are capable of understanding the world in ways you never imagined before, you cannot unlearn it. Each time Vanessa spoke to me with that edge of superiority, a small piece of me shifted inside. Each time my parents dismissed my feelings, another piece shifted. It felt like something was slowly aligning itself, preparing me for a moment I could not yet define. One evening in early 2019, I sat at my kitchen table sorting through bills when the thought suddenly came to me so clearly it startled me. I realized I could choose something different. I did not have to keep moving along the path they had chosen for me. I could use what Miriam taught me. I could build something of my own. That was the night I decided to leave my job. It had never fit me anyway, and Vanessa had made things unbearable by poking her way into my professional life. I called my friend Natalie, someone who had always believed I was capable of more than people assumed. She listened as I told her about my idea for a data analytics company focused on the housing market. She grew excited in a way I had not expected. She said she wanted in. We spent the next few months drawing up plans, writing proposals, learning everything we could about the kinds of services small property owners needed. Clearframe Analytics started in a tiny rented office with a second-hand desk and 2 mismatched chairs. Vanessa laughed when she heard about it. My parents said maybe it would give me something to do, but standing in that office with sunlight warming the old wood floors, I felt something I had rarely felt around my family. I felt steady, I felt chosen. By myself and by the woman who had seen me long before anyone else cared to. The truth of that time fills me now as I stand in my parents' dining room, watching them stare at the folder on the table, waiting for a version of me they can understand. They have no idea how far back this moment reaches, or how much of it belongs to someone they overlooked as easily as they overlooked me. I lifted my hand from the folder, and the room went still again, hanging in the space between what they thought they knew and what they were about to learn. Natalie was the first person who ever looked at me without confusion when I told her I wanted something bigger than the life I had been handed, after years of moving quietly around my family's expectations. Saying the words out loud to her felt almost dangerous. But she listened with the kind of attention that steadied me, the kind that told me I was not imagining my own potential. Clearframe began in early 2019 inside a small office on the east side of Portland. The building used to be a sewing studio, and the walls still carried faint outlines of chalk where patterns had been drafted years before. I liked that. It felt fitting to work in a place where things had once been created by hand, where someone before me had turned fabric into shape and structure. Some days the air smelled faintly of old cotton and warm dust. Other days it smelled like the possibility of something new. We bought a cheap metal desk from a resale shop and dragged in an old filing cabinet that screeched each time we opened it. None of it bothered me. For the first time, I was moving through a space where Vanessa's voice could not reach me and my parents' opinions could not shrink me. Natalie and I sat shoulder to shoulder building out data sets, designing small tools, testing systems that predicted maintenance cycles or identified hidden inefficiencies in property management. The work absorbed me completely. Vanessa did not understand it. She called one afternoon shortly after we launched and asked why I was wasting my time on something that would never scale. She said she knew the housing market better than anyone in the family, so she was doing me a favor by warning me that people like me did not survive long trying to compete in that world. I held the phone away from my ear, letting her words float around me without sinking their usual hooks. When she asked what I expected to gain from playing entrepreneur, I simply told her the truth. I said I was building something that mattered to me. She laughed, a low, amused sound that told me she had absolutely no intention of taking me seriously. My parents took her side without even realizing it. They told me I should not get my hopes up. They said Vanessa was trying to protect me from disappointment. They said the world Vanessa lived in was fast and complicated, and I was not built for that kind of stress. They wanted me to keep my job at the software company, even though 2 years earlier they had barely acknowledged I worked there at all. That inconsistency might have bothered me once, But Miriam's voice had settled too deeply into my mind. She had taught me that some people mistake their limitations for your own. Clearframe grew slowly but steadily. We picked up small clients first, landlords with a few units who needed help organizing tenant records or identifying why their vacancy rates kept spiking. Then came a mid-sized management company that needed projections for market shifts. Every new client felt like a vote of confidence I had never received from my own family. Natalie would bring pastries from the corner bakery on days she sensed I was particularly exhausted. Sometimes she stayed late and walked me through things I did not understand right away. She never doubted whether I could learn them. That alone changed me. It was late one afternoon in the fall of 2020, when a client sent over a cluster of documents that made my chest tighten in a strange, familiar way. We were building a predictive model for them and needed ownership details, historical rents, and repair logs. As I scanned the files, a name leapt off the page. It was the address of the duplex I lived in. My eyes slid down to the owner information, expecting to see Vanessa's name, or at least something tied loosely to the business she said she ran. Instead, I saw the name of a man I had never heard of, Greg Nolan. I stared at it so long, Natalie asked if I was feeling all right. I handed her the document and waited for her reaction. She raised her eyebrows and exhaled slowly. She asked me if I had ever actually seen anything in writing from Vanessa that proved she owned the place. I had not. Vanessa had always spoken with such authority that it never occurred to me to question her. My parents trusted her completely. I trusted her enough to move into that duplex, thinking she had done me a favor by letting me rent from her for less than market value. Natalie suggested we run a title search. She said it gently, sensing the mixture of disbelief and rising anger inside me. My hands were cold. My mind was racing through every conversation Vanessa and I had ever had about that house. All the times she bragged about carrying the full weight of its maintenance costs. All the times she reminded me how generous she was for keeping my rent low. All the times my parents praised her for taking on such responsibilities. I felt my breath shift, deeper and sharper, as though my lungs were trying to make space for a truth I had never considered. We contacted Mark Ellis, a local attorney who sometimes consulted with our clients. He was tall and calm in a way that made you feel as though everything he said had already been measured twice before leaving his mouth. Mark ran the title search for us and confirmed the ownership. The duplex had never belonged to Vanessa. It had never been part of any business she managed. It had never even passed near her financially. Greg Nolan had been the owner for years. I asked Mark what it meant that she had collected rent from me. He said it simply. If she was not authorized to collect it, she had no legal right to any of it. He could not know whether she had forged documentation or simply lied verbally. But either way, her actions were not lawful. I sat very still for a long time after he left. My mind kept circling back to the same image. Vanessa standing in our parents' living room, casually reminding me how grateful I should be for everything she provided. Vanessa telling our mother that she was tired of carrying the burden for me. Vanessa calling me ungrateful whenever I hesitated to praise her. I felt something old and tight loosen in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to clarity. Something that said this was no longer just about sibling rivalry or family imbalance. It was about truth. It was about power that had never really been hers. It was about finally seeing what had been in front of me all along. Natalie suggested I slow down and think before confronting Vanessa. She said that sometimes people who rely on lies do not collapse when the truth appears. They thrash. They cling. They hurt whoever is closest. I knew she was right. I also knew I had no intention of confronting Vanessa until I understood the situation completely. Knowledge had become my armor. Facts were becoming my strategy. So I began gathering everything quietly. Old receipts, emails, messages Vanessa had sent over the years. I saved copies of bank transfers she requested. I reviewed every line of communication between us. With each piece, the picture sharpened. Vanessa was not simply exaggerating her role in my life. She had built an entire story around herself that made her the savior and me the dependent. She needed me to believe it. My parents needed to believe it. And for a long time, I did too. There was nothing dramatic in my reaction. No shouting, no panic. Just an expanding calm. A sense of being grounded in a way that surprised me. I had spent so many years bending myself to keep the peace that standing tall, even in private, felt like learning how to breathe again. I did not tell my parents what I had found. I certainly did not tell Vanessa. I allowed her to continue thinking I was as manageable as ever. I let her think her confidence still intimidated me. I let her think she still controlled my choices. But my eyes were different now. My posture was different. And every quiet moment I spent in that duplex felt like a countdown I could almost hear ticking just beneath the floorboards. The truth had opened a door I could not close again. I did not know yet what waited on the other side, but I could feel the shift inside me. It was the same shift I had felt years earlier at Miriam's table, the moment she placed her folder in my hands, the moment she told me she believed I would know when it was time to act. As I sat with the documents spread across my desk at Clearframe, I felt that same certainty settling into place. My life had been moving toward this exact point long before I understood the path I was walking. And the path ahead, now illuminated in a way it had never been before, was beginning to reveal the shape of what would come next. Natalie was the first person who ever looked at me without confusion when I told her I wanted something bigger than the life I had been handed. After years of moving quietly around my family's expectations, saying the words out loud to her felt almost dangerous, but she listened with the kind of attention that steadied me, the kind that told me I was not imagining my own potential. Clearframe began in early 2019 inside a small office on the east side of Portland. The building used to be a sewing studio, and the walls still carried faint outlines of chalk where patterns had been drafted years before. I liked that. It felt fitting to work in a place where things had once been created by hand, where someone before me had turned fabric into shape and structure. Some days the air smelled faintly of old cotton and warm dust. Other days it smelled like the possibility of something new. We bought a cheap metal desk from a resale shop and dragged in an old filing cabinet that screeched each time we opened it. None of it bothered me. For the first time, I was moving through a space where Vanessa's voice could not reach me and my parents' opinions could not shrink me. Natalie and I sat shoulder to shoulder building out data sets, designing small tools, testing systems that predicted maintenance cycles or identified hidden inefficiencies in property management. The work absorbed me completely. Vanessa did not understand it. She called one afternoon shortly after we launched and asked why I was wasting my time on something that would never scale. She said she knew the housing market better than anyone in the family, so she was doing me a favor by warning me that people like me did not survive long trying to compete in that world. I held the phone away from my ear, letting her words float around me without sinking their usual hooks. When she asked what I expected to gain from playing entrepreneur, I simply told her the truth. I said I was building something that mattered to me. She laughed, a low, amused sound that told me she had absolutely no intention of taking me seriously. My parents took her side without even realizing it. They told me I should not get my hopes up. They said Vanessa was trying to protect me from disappointment. They said the world Vanessa lived in was fast and complicated, and I was not built for that kind of stress. They wanted me to keep my job at the software company, even though 2 years earlier they had barely acknowledged I worked there at all. That inconsistency might have bothered me once, but Miriam's voice had settled too deeply into my mind. She had taught me that some people mistake their limitations for your own. Clearframe grew slowly but steadily. We picked up small clients first, landlords with a few units who needed help organizing tenant records or identifying why their vacancy rates kept spiking. Then came a mid-sized management company that needed projections for market shifts. Every new client felt like a vote of confidence I had never received from my own family. Natalie would bring pastries from the corner bakery on days she sensed I was particularly exhausted. Sometimes she stayed late and walked me through things I did not understand right away. She never doubted whether I could learn them. That alone changed me. It was late one afternoon in the fall of 2020 when a client sent over a cluster of documents that made my chest tighten in a strange, familiar way. We were building a predictive model for them and needed ownership details, historical rents, and repair logs. As I scanned the files, a name leapt off the page. It was the address of the duplex I lived in. My eyes slid down to the owner information, expecting to see Vanessa's name, or at least something tied loosely to the business she said she ran. Instead, I saw the name of a man I had never heard of, Greg Nolan. I stared at it so long Natalie asked if I was feeling all right. I handed her the document and waited for her reaction. She raised her eyebrows and exhaled slowly. She asked me if I had ever actually seen anything in writing from Vanessa that proved she owned the place. I had not. Vanessa had always spoken with such authority that it never occurred to me to question her. My parents trusted her completely. I trusted her enough to move into that duplex, thinking she had done me a favor by letting me rent from her for less than market value. Natalie suggested we run a title search. She said it gently, sensing the mixture of disbelief and rising anger inside me. My hands were cold. My mind was racing through every conversation Vanessa and I had ever had about that house. All the times she bragged about carrying the full weight of its maintenance costs. All the times she reminded me how generous she was for keeping my rent low. All the times my parents praised her for taking on such responsibilities. I felt my breath shift, deeper and sharper, as though my lungs were trying to make space for a truth I had never considered. We contacted Mark Ellis, a local attorney who sometimes consulted with our clients. He was tall and calm in a way that made you feel as though everything he said had already been measured twice before leaving his mouth. Mark ran the title search for us and confirmed the ownership. The duplex had never belonged to Vanessa. It had never been part of any business she managed. It had never even passed near her financially. Greg Nolan had been the owner for years. I asked Mark what it meant that she had collected rent from me. He said it simply: if she was not authorized to collect it, she had no legal right to any of it. He could not know whether she had forged documentation or simply lied verbally. But either way, her actions were not lawful. I sat very still for a long time after he left. My mind kept circling back to the same image. Vanessa standing in our parents' living room, casually reminding me how grateful I should be for everything she provided. Vanessa telling our mother that she was tired of carrying the burden for me. Vanessa calling me ungrateful whenever I hesitated to praise her. I felt something old and tight loosen in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to clarity. Something that said this was no longer just about sibling rivalry or family imbalance. It was about truth. It was about power that had never really been hers. It was about finally seeing what had been in front of me all along. Natalie suggested I slow down and think before confronting Vanessa. She said that sometimes people who rely on lies do not collapse when the truth appears. They thrash, they cling, they hurt whoever is closest. I knew she was right. I also knew I had no intention of confronting Vanessa until I understood the situation completely. Knowledge had become my armor. Facts were becoming my strategy. So I began gathering everything quietly. Old receipts, emails, messages Vanessa had sent over the years. I saved copies of bank transfers she requested. I reviewed every line of communication between us. With each piece, the picture sharpened. Vanessa was not simply exaggerating her role in my life. She had built an entire story around herself that made her the savior and me the dependent. She needed me to believe it. My parents needed to believe it. And for a long time I did too. There was nothing dramatic in my reaction. No shouting, no panic, just an expanding calm, a sense of being grounded in a way that surprised me. I had spent so many years bending myself to keep the peace that standing tall, even in private, felt like learning how to breathe again. I did not tell my parents what I had found. I certainly did not tell Vanessa. I allowed her to continue thinking I was as manageable as ever. I let her think her confidence still intimidated me. I let her think she still controlled my choices, but my eyes were different now. My posture was different. And every quiet moment I spent in that duplex felt like a countdown I could almost hear ticking just beneath the floorboards. The truth had opened a door I could not close again. I did not know yet what waited on the other side, but I could feel the shift inside me. It was the same shift I had felt years earlier at Miriam's table. The moment she placed her folder in my hands. The moment she told me she believed I would know when it was time to act. As I sat with the document spread across my desk at Clearframe, I felt that same certainty settling into place. My life had been moving toward this exact point long before I understood the path I was walking. And the path ahead, now illuminated in a way it had never been before, was beginning to reveal the shape of what would come next. I gathered every document on my desk, stacking them neatly until the edges lined up, then folded my hands over the top as if doing that might steady the thrum in my chest. There was no denying what the papers showed. Vanessa had never owned the duplex. She had never managed it. She had never even been listed as an authorized contact. Everything she had ever said to me about carrying the weight of that place had been nothing but performance. And suddenly the last 10 years of her comments and demands rearranged themselves in my memory, like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for someone to turn them right side up. I sat back in my chair, letting the truth settle over me in slow, steady waves. For the first time in my life, I was seeing Vanessa without the filter of our family's beliefs. There was no heroic older sister, no gifted caretaker, no overworked woman holding everything together. There was only a person who had spent years crafting a story in which she always occupied the brightest light, no matter who had to dim themselves to make it possible. Natalie leaned against the doorframe, watching me quietly. She could always read my thoughts long before I said anything. She asked if I was still all right. I nodded because I was, though not in any way I had been before. She crossed the room and sat beside me, her voice low and careful as she said it was important that I take this slowly, that I stay grounded, that I recognize the power of what I had learned without letting it swallow me whole. I appreciated her worry, but inside I felt something entirely different. Not fear, not panic, not even anger. I felt an awakening, the kind that grips you after years of pretending you were content being underestimated. The world looked clearer, sharper, more manageable. I told Natalie I needed to know everything, every detail about how long Greg Nolan had owned the property, whether he had ever met Vanessa, whether she had used any paperwork with his name to make her lies more believable. Natalie suggested we request full records through Mark. She reminded me that Greg would likely be cooperative. He had no reason to hide anything and, based on what we knew, plenty of reasons to be frustrated by anyone misrepresenting his property. So we contacted Mark again. He returned the next morning with a folder thicker than I expected. He laid it on my desk and sat across from me with the patience of someone who had walked many clients through uncomfortable truths. He explained that Greg had been the owner for almost 12 years. He had never hired Vanessa. He had never spoken to her. He had certainly never authorized her to collect rent. I remember the way my stomach dropped at that. All the nights I apologized to her for being late with a payment. All the times I thanked her for the supposed discount she gave me. All the holidays where she reminded me that maintaining the duplex was an enormous burden she carried out of love for the family. She had crafted an entire identity around something that had nothing to do with her. I asked Mark what recourse I had. He said that technically I could pursue repayment or file a complaint, but he encouraged me to think strategically before taking any action. People who hold on to power through lies often react badly when that power is threatened. He told me that timing would matter more than anything else. I thought about that long after he left. Timing, opportunity, leverage. Words Miriam had used in her own way years earlier. It felt strange sensing her presence in the middle of all of this, but I could almost hear her steady voice telling me to observe the structure first, then decide where to place pressure. That afternoon I drove home through a gray Portland drizzle. The city always felt quieter on days like that, softened by mist. When I reached the duplex, I sat in my car for a long stretch before going inside. The building looked the same as every other day, pale paint chipping slightly at the corners, ivy curling along one side of the fence. Nothing in its appearance betrayed the truth that had been hidden behind it for so long. Inside my unit, I walked through each room slowly, noticing details I had overlooked for years. The narrow hallway where Vanessa once lectured me about respecting property she claimed to manage. The old kitchen tiles she insisted she had paid to repair. The living room window she blamed me for cracking, even though the fracture had been there when I moved in. Every memory carried a new shape now. Vanessa's scolding no longer sounded like responsibility. It sounded like control. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, letting the weight of the discovery settle deeper. It felt like standing on a shoreline, where the tide had finally gone out enough to reveal everything that had been buried beneath it. The truth was exposed now, and I could not pretend otherwise. A few days later, I reached out to Greg. Meeting him felt surreal. He was kind in a weary way, the kind of man who had spent too much time fixing things himself, because hiring help always seemed more complicated than solving problems alone. He apologized for the state of the building. He said he had been overwhelmed the past few years and was thinking of selling. His voice softened when he said the market was strong for sellers, but that he preferred handing the property to someone who would take care of it. He had no idea how much those words meant to me. I asked gentle questions, careful not to reveal anything about Vanessa. He confirmed he had never authorized anyone to represent him. He admitted he had been receiving rent irregularly from another tenant, but had always assumed people paid through different online systems. That explained how Vanessa had covered her tracks. Most of my payments she had taken directly. A few she transferred to Greg manually, just often enough to avoid suspicion. When I returned to my car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel while the rain pounded softly overhead. It would have been easy to let hatred bloom in me then, easy to picture confronting Vanessa, listing every deception she had ever spun, demanding she explain how she justified any of it. But hatred was too simple for the reality in front of me. What I felt was something deeper, a sense that the ground beneath our family had always been unstable, and now I finally understood why. I brought the information back to Natalie, and we began mapping out what it all meant. She said that this was not just a lie. It was a pattern, a long-running structure built on the assumption that I would never question the story. She reminded me softly that people like Vanessa build their worlds out of mirrors, not bricks, and that mirrors crack the moment someone refuses to reflect what they expect. I considered how to move forward. Confronting Vanessa immediately would only feed her sense of theatrical power. She would accuse me of ingratitude, twist every fact, spin a story that placed her at the center of sacrifice again. Challenging her too soon would only give her time to prepare her defenses. I needed something stronger, something final, something that aligned with the truth Miriam had trusted me to carry. So I began documenting everything with a steadiness that surprised even me. Screenshots, bank statements, messages, photos of the duplex showing old damage, evidence that Vanessa had threatened to raise rent long before the $12,000 stunt, recordings from neighbors who had overheard her snapping at me outside. I stored everything privately, labeling each file carefully, creating a timeline that could not be dismissed. As the days passed, I felt myself settling into a kind of quiet determination. I no longer walked around my life bracing for Vanessa's moods. A strange freedom had taken root. It felt like someone had finally opened a window in a room I had been living in for years. Without realizing, the air had grown stale. One evening, as I finished scanning a stack of paperwork, my phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. She asked if I could find time to talk because she felt unappreciated again. She said I had not acknowledged her last big sale and that it was starting to weigh on her. I stared at the words on the screen, wondering how many times I had let messages like that pull me back into the shape she needed me to be. But not this time. Not anymore. I placed the phone face down on the table and let out a long, slow breath. The truth was no longer something fragile I had to protect. It was becoming a path. And for the first time in my life, I felt ready to follow it wherever it led. Outside, the rain eased into a soft mist. The city lights blurred slightly as they reflected through my window, and I found myself thinking again of Miriam, her steady presence, her unwavering belief, her quiet insistence that I would know when the moment arrived to act. It was becoming clear that moment was much closer than I had realized. The moment kept circling in my mind long after the rain stopped, and I found myself staring at the ceiling that night with an awareness I could not shake. Something was shifting again, something quiet and steady, the same feeling I used to get when Miriam slid a new stack of documents across her dining table. It was the sensation of a door beginning to open. I did not know yet where it would lead, only that I needed to be ready for it when it did. A few days later, I received an email from Greg Nolan asking if we could meet again. He said he had been reviewing his finances and wanted to talk through his plans for the duplex. My chest tightened with a mixture of anticipation and fear. I knew what he was likely considering, and I also knew that if he brought it up, I needed to be prepared. We met at a small coffee shop near Selwood, a place with old brick walls and soft lighting that made every conversation feel slightly more intimate than it should. Greg looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes and a heaviness in his shoulders that made him appear older than when I had seen him last. He thanked me for meeting him, then lowered his voice as he admitted he was ready to sell. The words landed softly but carried a weight I felt all the way down to my bones. I asked him why. He explained that the cost of maintaining the duplex had been rising for years, that he had taken on more repairs than he could manage, and that a few personal setbacks had drained his savings. He said he needed a fresh start, but did not want to sell to developers who would flip the property without care. He paused, then looked me directly in the eyes. He said he remembered the way I had talked about the building the first time we met. He said I spoke like someone who valued stability and responsibility. He said that if I were interested, he would prefer selling to me. For a moment, I simply stared at him. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and deep. It was as if the universe had placed a key in my hand without fanfare, trusting me to recognize it. The down payment was possible. The loan would be manageable if ClearFrame continued to grow. Miriam had prepared me for this exact kind of opportunity long before I understood what she was doing. I told Greg I was interested. His shoulders dropped a little in relief. He suggested I speak to a lender, then said he would give me first consideration before listing the property. I thanked him, and as I walked back to my car, the cold air struck my face with a clarity that made everything inside me sharpen. That evening, I met with Natalie at the office and told her everything. She let out a long whistle, one hand still resting on the mouse, frozen mid-work. She said it made perfect sense, that the timing was uncanny, that sometimes life lined up in ways that made you wonder if someone was looking out for you. She did not have to say Miriam's name. We were both thinking it. We spent the next week reviewing financial projections, calculating mortgage estimates, analyzing potential risks. ClearFrame had been doing well, but the decision was still huge. Then again, I had spent my whole life letting other people define what was too big for me. I was tired of living that way. When I met with the lender, I felt a tremor of nerves, the old familiar fear of being underestimated, but it faded as soon as I began answering questions. ClearFrame had a track record. My credit was strong, my savings were sufficient. The loan officer nodded through my explanations with an ease I had never felt from my own family. It took 1 week for the pre-approval to come through. I called Greg the moment I received the email. His voice warmed, relieved, grateful. He said he would begin the paperwork. I could hear something like hope in his tone, and it struck me how strange it was that a man who barely knew me had more faith in my responsibility than the people who had raised me. The following month felt like walking through a series of checkpoints, each one leading me deeper into a reality I had never dared imagine. Inspections, appraisals, title confirmations, nights spent organizing documents and double-checking numbers while the city outside blurred in the winter rain. I carried Miriam's folder with me everywhere, her financial notes tucked between new papers, her handwriting steady and sure, even after death. But nothing ever moves forward without resistance. 2 weeks before closing, the bank requested additional verification of my projected income. It was not unreasonable, but the timing was brutal. I spent hours preparing reports for them, compiling everything from monthly revenue charts to signed contracts. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of panic, a whisper of the old voice that said, maybe I was not meant for this after all. Natalie stayed late with me at the office that night. She ordered takeout and spread my documents across the table, helping me refine every line until the spreadsheets looked polished and clean. She kept reminding me of how far I had come. She said that doubt was just an echo from a life I no longer lived. When my anxiety finally eased, I realized how lucky I was to have someone who understood both my mind and my wounds. The bank approved the additional documentation the next morning. I felt lightheaded with relief, as if someone had lifted a weight from my lungs. The final step was scheduling the closing date with Mark. When he called to confirm it, his voice held a note of satisfaction that told me he was rooting for me too. The day of the signing arrived on a crisp winter morning. I drove to the title office with a quiet awareness humming through my bloodstream. It was the same awareness I had felt moments before Miriam first placed her trust in me. The same awareness I felt when I launched ClearFrame. It was the sense that I was stepping into myself fully, without apology. The office smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and fresh paper. Greg arrived a few minutes after I did, his smile tired but genuine. We shook hands, then sat across from each other as the notary placed the documents in front of us. The process took less than half an hour. A few signatures, a few initialed pages, a final confirmation. When it was done, Greg closed the folder and extended his hand again. He said he hoped the building would treat me well. I thanked him because there was no elegant way to express what owning that duplex meant to me. I walked out of the office holding the deed in a plain manila envelope, my fingers curled tightly around it. The winter light was soft, drifting through the bare branches like something sacred. I stood still on the sidewalk, letting the moment settle into me. For the first time in my life, I owned something no one could take from me. something that belonged to me, not because of who I was supposed to be in my family, but because of who I had become on my own. I drove to the duplex slowly, following familiar streets that felt different now. Every turn held a new weight. When I pulled into the driveway, I did not get out immediately. I sat there with the envelope in my lap and felt the truth of everything I had built in silence. Vanessa had no idea. My parents had no idea. And for the first time, that secrecy felt powerful instead of lonely. I finally stepped out of the car and stood in front of the building. The paint still chipped in the same places. The ivy still curled along the fence. But the air felt different. The ground felt different. The space around me felt open in a way it never had before. I went inside and set the deed on my kitchen table. As I looked around the room, it struck me how much of my life had been shaped inside these walls. Every small wound, every quiet victory, every moment of growth no one saw. And now, without anyone realizing it, I had reclaimed the very place where I had once felt most powerless. I pressed my palm lightly against the table, grounding myself in the truth. This was only the beginning. The real confrontation was still ahead, and Vanessa still believed she owned the story. She had no idea how wrong she was. The thought settled over me like the calm before a storm, steady and certain. As the house held its breath around me, I stayed in that quiet stillness for a while, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the old building settling into the cold evening. It felt strange realizing that the house I had once tiptoed through was now entirely mine. Not in the way Vanessa used to claim ownership with her inflated stories and dramatic sighs, but in a real way that came with paperwork, signatures, and the heavy responsibility of truth. It made every shadow in the hallway and every uneven floorboard feel different, like they were finally acknowledging me instead of looming over me. Life did not pause just because something monumental had happened. The days that followed blended into a rhythm that felt both familiar and transformed. At Clearframe, Natalie and I pushed forward on new projects, fine-tuning a predictive model for a management company that wanted to overhaul their entire maintenance system. Outside the office, Portland was easing into early spring, the kind of weather where the sky could not decide whether to rain or brighten. I drove home each evening with a steadiness I had never felt before. Vanessa, meanwhile, seemed determined to prove that her control over me had not weakened. She began sending messages more frequently, texts filled with vaguely irritated reminders that I had not shown enough appreciation for her latest professional accomplishments. She mentioned a staged home she had recently sold in Lake Oswego and said it would not hurt me to acknowledge how hard she was working. I read her messages and placed my phone back down without responding. Silence was beginning to feel like a new language I was learning to speak fluently. About 2 weeks after the closing, she called me while I was finishing dinner. Her voice was sharp, brittle, the way it always became when she sensed I was not falling into line. She asked if I planned to attend an upcoming family dinner and said it would be a good time for me to make things right with her. She did not specify what making things right meant, but I already knew. Compliments, public praise, acknowledgement of her greatness. She always wanted the same currency. When I did not commit to anything, she let out a long, exasperated sigh. She said that my attitude had become difficult lately and that she was beginning to believe I no longer valued her. She paused for effect, then said she had decided to increase my rent as a motivator. She claimed the new rate would reflect the emotional labor required to deal with someone who did not support her. When she said the numbers out loud, my stomach tightened. Not because I would owe anything, but because the performance was so painfully familiar. She declared the new rent to be $12,000 per month. The words hung suspended on the line between us. I felt an unexpected surge of calm. She believed she was delivering a blow big enough to shake my entire foundation. She expected panic, pleading, a return to old habits, but the truth in my possession had shifted everything. I told her I would look at the notice when she sent it, then hung up before she could launch into another speech. She emailed me a formal-looking letter that evening, filled with made-up fees and invented penalties. Lack of courtesy charge, negative emotional impact fee, failure to uphold household harmony fine. The absurdity would have been funny if it had not been built on years of conditioning. I opened a folder on my laptop and saved every document there. One afternoon, Chloe Myers knocked on my door. She lived in the unit next to mine and had always been friendly in a quiet, observant way. She held a small digital recorder in her hand and asked if she could speak to me privately. I let her in, and she sat at my kitchen table with an anxious look. She told me she had overheard Vanessa yelling at me outside a few weeks earlier, the day Vanessa claimed I had embarrassed her with my silence at a family brunch. Chloe said she had captured part of the argument because it sounded concerning, and she was worried something might escalate. She pressed play. Vanessa's voice filled my kitchen, sharp and cutting. She accused me of sabotaging her image. She called me selfish, ungrateful, emotionally clueless. She threatened to raise my rent until I learned how to show proper appreciation. Hearing the recording did not hurt the way her words used to. Instead, it confirmed everything I had been documenting. I thanked Chloe for her courage. She looked relieved, as if she had been carrying the burden of that recording alone. As spring deepened, the pressure from Vanessa only escalated. She sent me another notice, then followed up with a message saying she would give me until the next family gathering to acknowledge her generosity publicly. She hinted that she might evict me if I did not comply. Reading her words made something inside me settle rather than rise. It was no longer fear, it was recognition. She was tightening the same grip she had always used, but this time she had no idea it was closing around nothing. My parents sided with her predictably. My mother called one evening, repeating Vanessa's complaints as if they were objective truths. She said I needed to understand the strain my sister lived under. She said my refusal to offer support only made things worse. My father joined the conversation to remind me that Vanessa had always been the strong one and that I needed to be more flexible. The fact that they believed she owned the duplex still made the irony sting, though in a strangely distant way, as if it belonged to a life I had stepped out of. As they lectured me, I sat at my dining table tracing my fingers over the outline of the deed beneath a stack of papers. The smoothness of the envelope felt grounding. I listened to their words the way someone listens to an old familiar song, one they no longer feel connected to, but still recognize by heart. When they finished, I simply told them I would attend the dinner. I could hear the satisfaction bloom in their voices. They had no idea that agreement did not mean surrender. The day before the dinner, Vanessa sent one final message. She said I should be ready to acknowledge her publicly and thank her for everything she had done for me, especially for giving me a home I could afford. She wrote that it would reflect well on our family. She ended with a warning that if I chose to embarrass her again, she would take action. I stared at her message for a long time, not because her words had any real power, but because they revealed exactly how tightly she clung to the story she had built. She had invested years into shaping herself into the hero of our family, the one who sacrificed and guided and carried. If the truth ever came to light, it would not just ruin her professional image. It would expose her entire identity as fiction. Later that evening, I gathered the documents one last time. The deed with my signature, the title history, the bank transfers, the emails she had sent, the recordings Chloe had provided, the notes Mark had taken. I organized everything carefully into a folder, then placed it beside my coat on the chair near the door. I stood in the center of my living room and let the stillness settle around me again. I thought of Miriam, of all the times she told me to prepare quietly, to learn carefully, to act only when I understood the full shape of the truth. For years, I thought she was preparing me for life in general. I had no idea she was preparing me for this. When I finally lay down that night, I felt no anxiety, only a quiet anticipation, steady and certain. Vanessa believed she was walking into a dinner where she would be the center of admiration again. She believed she would control the room the way she always had. She believed I was still the younger sister who would allow it. But morning was coming, and none of them had any idea what it would bring. The morning arrived with a thin, pale light stretching across my bedroom ceiling, the kind that makes everything feel suspended for a moment before the world fully wakes. I lay still, listening to the distant sound of a garbage truck moving slowly down the street. The soft rumble settling into my chest, like a reminder that the day would unfold whether I felt ready or not. I closed my eyes briefly, gathering myself the way Miriam had taught me, steady breath in, steady breath out, letting the quiet sharpen rather than soften me. I rose slowly, moving through my home with a sense of purpose that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. The folder sat where I had placed it the night before, its corners aligned neatly as if waiting for my hand. I poured a cup of coffee and sat with it at my kitchen table, letting the warmth travel through my fingers. My mind replayed the years that had led me to this day, not in sadness or anger, but in clarity. Every moment of silence, every dismissal, every time I had stepped aside while my family praised Vanessa, had shaped the ground beneath this moment. Natalie called while I was rinsing my cup. Her voice was calm, grounding, as she asked if I had slept. I told her the truth. I slept better than I expected. She let out a quiet breath of relief. She reminded me that I did not owe anyone theatrics, that all I had to do was present the truth plainly. She said the truth had its own weight, and I did not need to force anything. Before hanging up, she added softly that she was proud of me. I stood for a long time after the call ended, letting those words settle in a place inside me that had been hollow for years. By mid-afternoon, the house felt too quiet, so I began reviewing the documents again. The deed with my signature, the title history, the bank transfers showing where the rent had truly gone, the emails filled with her invented charges, the recording of her voice cutting into the air with accusations. I arranged them in the order I planned to present them, one layer after another, a sequence that would make denial impossible. There was no anger inside me now, only an odd calm that felt almost like resolve. I worried briefly about my parents, about the look that would cross their faces when they realized they had poured praise and trust into a story that never belonged to Vanessa. I wondered if they would finally see the cracks that had been there all along, or if they would cling to their belief in her no matter what evidence stood in front of them. It was hard to imagine either outcome without feeling something heavy settle behind my ribs. Closer to the evening, clouds gathered over Portland, darkening the sky to a muted blue. I watched raindrops begin their slow descent on the window pane, streaking downward like thin trails of ink. There was something soothing in the sound. It reminded me of the afternoons at Miriam's house. Both of us bent over a table filled with documents while the rain tapped lightly on the glass. She used to tell me that storms brought clarity because they wiped away what had grown dusty and left things sharp again. I dressed slowly, choosing something simple and steady. I did not want to walk into the restaurant looking wounded or overly formal. I wanted to look like myself, the self they had never truly seen. Before leaving, I touched the folder once more, then slipped it into my bag. On the drive to the restaurant, my thoughts drifted uninvited to the night years earlier when Vanessa had humiliated me publicly over a forgotten compliment. I replayed the way she stared at me then, cold and triumphant, as if she had done something necessary for the greater good of the family. My younger self had believed her. I felt a quiet ache for that version of me, the one who had spent so long trying to be small enough not to upset the balance of the household. That ache, however, no longer controlled me. It was simply a reminder of the distance between who I had been and who I had become. Traffic slowed as I approached downtown. I could see the restaurant lights glowing softly beneath the gray sky, reflections shimmering on the wet sidewalk. I parked a block away and took a moment to breathe before stepping into the cool evening air. The scent of rain on pavement filled my lungs. Each step toward the entrance felt deliberate, as if the ground beneath me had firmed with every stride. Inside, the hostess guided me to the private dining area. I heard their voices before I saw them. My mother sounded cheerful, that soft performative tone she used at gatherings. My father's laughter rumbled low. Vanessa's voice carried that familiar confidence, bright and polished, the kind she used when she believed the night belonged to her. When I stepped into the room, they all turned. Vanessa smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. She looked me over as if checking to see if I appeared remorseful or compliant. My mother reached for my hand, telling me she was glad I made it. My father nodded with a pleased expression, as though my presence itself confirmed that everything was returning to normal. I sat down slowly, placing my bag beside my chair. Vanessa began talking almost instantly. She spoke about her recent sale, about how exhausted she had been juggling work and family obligations, about how much she had done to keep things running smoothly for everyone. My parents listened with admiration, nodding at all the right moments. I watched her, not with judgment, but with an awareness I had never possessed before. She no longer intimidated me. She no longer held any part of my foundation. After a few minutes, she turned her attention toward me. She said she hoped I had taken some time to reflect on my behavior and that tonight would be an opportunity to reset. She said it would mean a lot to her if I expressed some appreciation for everything she had done for me, especially providing me with a place to live at such a reasonable rate. Those last words hovered in the air like a spark waiting for oxygen. I felt the shift around the table, subtle but unmistakable. My parents smiled encouragingly, expecting me to follow the script I had always followed. A small part of me winced, not from fear, but from the quiet recognition of how deeply they had internalized a false story. I reached into my bag, feeling the smooth surface of the folder beneath my fingertips. My pulse remained steady. I lifted it slowly and placed it on the table. Vanessa stopped speaking mid-sentence. My father's smile faltered. My mother frowned slightly, confused. For a moment, no one moved. The rain outside intensified. The sound softened through the windows, but still present enough to feel like another heartbeat in the room. I looked at Vanessa, seeing not the version of her my family idolized, but the truth behind her cultivated image. She stared at the folder, then at me, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. I pulled the first document from inside and set it gently in front of me. My hands did not tremble. My voice did not crack. The calm inside me gathered itself, and just as I opened my mouth to speak, the waiter stepped into the room to refill water glasses, pausing the moment with an unintentional softness that somehow made everything sharper. I waited in silence, knowing exactly what would follow when he left, feeling the weight of the truth poised like a held breath about to be released. The waiter finally stepped out of the room, letting the door ease shut behind him, and the quiet that followed seemed to press against my skin. My parents both shifted in their seats, trying to read my expression. Vanessa did not bother to hide her irritation. She leaned forward slightly, tapping one manicured finger against the table as if signaling that it was her turn to speak again. But she waited. For the first time in a long time, she waited for me. I opened the folder slowly, letting the papers separate with a soft whisper. I felt the shift in the room as surely as if the air itself had tilted. Vanessa tried to regain her composure by lifting her chin and arranging her features into something that looked like confidence. My mother cleared her throat. My father leaned closer, squinting as if any document I held would surely be something trivial. I began by placing one sheet in the center of the table. My voice came out steady and clear. I said that before anyone continued with assumptions about what I owed Vanessa. There was something they needed to see. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but something in my tone must have stopped her, because she closed it again and waited. Vanessa let out a short laugh. She said she hoped I had not brought more excuses tonight, because she was tired of cleaning up my mistakes. Her eyes flicked toward the paper as if expecting something sloppy or irrelevant, something she could dismiss with a single sharp comment. I slid the document closer to her. I did not explain it. I wanted her to read the words herself. Her smile faltered first. Then the muscles around her mouth tightened. She read line by line, her eyes darting back and forth as if she could force the text to change if she stared hard enough. Finally, she looked up at me. Her face pale beneath the soft restaurant lighting. She asked where I had gotten it, her voice thinner than before. There was no anger yet, only disbelief. My father reached for the sheet, adjusting his glasses, when he realized he was looking at the official title history of the duplex, with every recorded owner listed and dated. He blinked several times in confusion. He asked if this was some kind of clerical mistake. My mother, leaning over his shoulder, frowned and said she did not see Vanessa's name anywhere. I told them she had never owned the duplex. She had never managed it. She had never held any legal right to collect rent. I let the truth land with as little emotion as possible, because it did not need embellishment. It was enough on its own. For a few seconds, the only sound was the muted clatter from the main dining room outside. Then Vanessa scoffed sharply, a brittle sound that cracked under its own weight. She said I must have misunderstood something on top, that she had handled the property for years. She insisted the paperwork must be incomplete. She said I did not understand real estate the way she did. I reached for the next document and placed it beside the first. It was a printout of bank transfer records showing where my rent payments had gone. Not to Greg Nolan, not to a management company, directly, consistently, to Vanessa's personal checking account. I watched her eyes lock on the numbers, watched the first flicker of panic appear beneath her carefully arranged expression. My father asked why the payment descriptions looked inconsistent. My mother asked why some months were missing entirely. I said quietly that those were the months when Vanessa had transferred a partial amount to the real owner, just often enough to avoid drawing attention. The rest she kept. My mother's face drained of its color. My father's confusion shifted into a tight, controlled anger, though he did not seem sure yet where to direct it. Vanessa pushed back from the table abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. She said the documents were taken out of context. She said I was misinterpreting things. She said I was choosing the wrong moment to challenge her generosity. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not with sadness, but with the dawning awareness that the room had shifted against her. I did not raise my voice. I reached into the folder again and placed the next paper down. This one was a certified copy of the deed bearing my name, Evelyn Hart, owner, purchased in full, recorded by the county, no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The sound my father made was soft, almost strangled. My mother pressed a hand to her chest, staring at me as if seeing a stranger. Vanessa's mouth opened but no sound came out. Her eyes fixed on the line with my signature, moving over it again and again as if she could erase it through sheer will. I explained how the sale had happened, how Greg had never known she was involved, how the truth had been buried beneath years of assumptions and unquestioned claims. I told them that I had said nothing until now because timing mattered, because truth needed to be placed carefully in front of people who had spent years refusing to see it. Vanessa finally found her voice again. She shouted that I had betrayed her, that I had gone behind her back, that I had taken something that should have been hers. My father snapped at her to lower her voice. My mother whispered her name with a quiet, pleading tone, the same tone she used when Vanessa was younger and on the verge of one of her fits. Vanessa jabbed a finger toward me. She said I had always been jealous, that I waited for the perfect moment to humiliate her, that I had orchestrated this entire thing simply to make her look bad. She kept talking, her words unraveling faster than she could control them, and for the first time in my life, I watched her lose the room, completely. My father asked when she had ever owned the duplex. She said she managed it unofficially. He asked why there was no paperwork. She said she did not need any. My mother asked why the rent had gone into her personal account. Vanessa said she had fronted costs for years and was collecting back what she was owed. I saw the doubt spread across their faces like a slow stain. They had believed her for so long that the truth was almost too heavy for them to hold. I lifted the last set of documents, screenshots of her emails, copies of her notices with fabricated fees, a line-by-line breakdown of her invented charges. Then Chloe's recording. I pressed play on my phone, letting Vanessa's own voice fill the quiet room. Her threats, her insults, her repeated insistence that she would raise the rent until I learned to show proper gratitude. My mother covered her mouth. My father stared at the table. Vanessa stopped breathing for a moment, her face flushing deep red, then fading into a pale, unsettled gray. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed felt vast. Vanessa surged forward as if to snatch the papers, but my father reached out instinctively, placing a firm hand on her arm. His voice was quiet but final when he told her to sit down. She jerked away from him, unable to obey, unable to defend, unable to comprehend the collapse of the story she had built. Her voice came out in a broken whisper. She said none of this changed the fact that I owed her respect, that she had done everything for our family, that she deserved better. I looked at her and felt something inside me settle. Not triumph, not vindication, something steadier. The truth had finally entered the room, and nothing she said could pull it back out. I gathered the papers calmly, aligning them into one clean stack, and rested my hands lightly on top, waiting for the last waves of her denial to break against the table between us. She kept insisting she deserved better, her voice thinned by panic and disbelief, but the argument no longer had anything to cling to. The room had shifted. There was no way back for her now. My parents sat motionless, their faces drained in a way I had never seen before. My father's hand still rested on the table, fingers curled slightly inward, as if he were holding on to the last thread of the story he had believed for so long. My mother's eyes glistened with something sharp and unsettled. Not quite sorrow, not quite guilt, but something close to both. I let the silence linger because I needed them to feel it. Vanessa stared at me with a desperation that made her look strangely small. All her rehearsed confidence, her curated image, Her relentless insistence on admiration had cracked open. The pieces lay scattered across the space between us, and there was nothing left for her to hide behind. I spoke quietly, not because I was afraid, but because the moment itself felt too heavy for anything louder. I told them I had become the owner of the duplex almost 3 years earlier. I told them I had taken on the responsibility with intention. I said I had kept it private because I wanted to understand the full truth of the situation before confronting it. I said it was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from me long before money ever entered the picture. My father blinked, a slow, disoriented movement, then asked why I had not come to them sooner. He asked why I had not shared anything. His voice sounded older than I remembered. I looked at him and answered honestly. I told him I had learned over the years that coming to them did not change anything, that when I was hurt they called it oversensitivity, that when Vanessa crossed lines they called it responsibility, that somewhere along the way I stopped hoping they would choose fairness over familiarity. The words struck him visibly. He leaned back slightly as if absorbing a physical blow. My mother reached for her napkin, dabbing tears that had begun to pool at the corners of her eyes. She whispered her daughter's name, not mine, but Vanessa's, as if speaking it would somehow anchor the drifting pieces of the family image she had held together for decades. Vanessa stepped back from the table. Her breath came fast and shallow. She shook her head as if refusing to accept any version of reality that did not center her. She said I had manipulated them. She said I had waited for the perfect moment to humiliate her. She said I was taking advantage of their trust. Her denial grew louder, more frantic, a sound like something splintering from the inside. I let her speak until her voice thinned into exhaustion. Then I placed one final document on the table. It was not another piece of evidence. It was a letter from Mark explaining, in plain legal terms, the consequences of collecting rent without ownership or authorization. He had written it at my request, not as a threat but as a boundary, as something tangible that could no longer be twisted or minimized. My father read it and swallowed hard. My mother pressed a hand to her forehead. Vanessa stared at the page without blinking, her face drained of color, her breathing uneven. I told them there were 2 paths forward. The first involved lawyers and formal complaints. The second involved honesty, admission, accountability. I said I was not seeking repayment. I was not interested in dragging the family through a public mess. What I wanted was an end to the story Vanessa had written, a full stop, a new beginning built on truth. For the first time since the confrontation began, Vanessa looked at me like she saw someone she did not recognize. Her shoulders dropped slightly. The fight drained out of her expression, leaving only fear and confusion. She asked what I wanted from her. The question was small, fragile, and it startled me with how different it sounded from her usual tone. I told her I wanted nothing, not an apology, not gratitude, not an acknowledgement. I said the truth was enough. I said I no longer needed anything from her to feel whole. My mother began to cry quietly then. Tears slid down her face, and she looked at me with a softness I had rarely been offered. She said she had never realized how deep the wounds had gone. She said she thought she had been protecting harmony, not realizing she had been fueling imbalance. I could hear the sincerity in her voice, but also the years of unspoken regret. My father cleared his throat, his voice rough. He said he respected the way I had handled things, that he understood now why I had stayed silent for so long. He said he saw me differently tonight, not because of the documents, but because of the steadiness I had shown. His words were not a perfect repair, but they were a beginning. Vanessa sank into her chair slowly. Her face turned away. She did not speak again. She simply stared at the wall as if searching for a version of herself she could still believe in. I did not feel joy watching her unravel. I felt something quieter, relief, closure, the ending of a chapter that had lasted far too long. I gathered my papers, slid them back into the folder, and zipped my bag. The movement felt final. I stood, and my parents instinctively rose with me. My mother touched my arm lightly, unsure if she was allowed to hold on longer. My father looked like he wanted to say more, but could not find the words. Vanessa did not look up. I told them I would check in soon. I said it softly, without resentment. Then I stepped toward the door, feeling the air shift behind me as I walked away from the version of my family I had known for 34 years. Outside, The rain had stopped. The street glistened beneath the lamplight, and the air felt cool and clear against my skin. I took a slow breath, feeling something in me settle into place. This time the quiet did not feel like suppression. It felt like peace. I walked to my car and paused with my hand on the door, letting the night wrap around me. Everything that had led to this moment unfolded in my mind, like a long, winding path. I saw Miriam's gentle smile. I saw Natalie's unwavering belief. I saw my younger self standing alone in her childhood bedroom, wondering if she would ever be seen. I felt a wave of gratitude for the girl who endured more than she understood, because she believed one day things would change. And they had, not because I fought harder, not because I screamed louder, but because I finally stepped into a truth that had been waiting for me all along. As I drove home through the quiet Portland streets, I felt something I had not felt in years: space, agency. The sense that my life no longer revolved around protecting someone else's fragile ego. I was free. The story was mine now. If you have ever faced someone who tried to control your narrative or silence your truth, I would love to hear your experience. Comment below and tell me how you reclaimed your voice. Your stories matter here, and I hope you stay and share them with me.